Once you've installed Advanced Thema, you've jumped into the settings and you start looking at all the options there, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer number of settings, some of which are legacy, some of which are new. Where do you start? What do you actually use? Well, I'm going to go through what I would consider to be the most important features that you should enable on your copy of Advanced Thema. However, I'm not going to cover every single option because I would be here for a week. But these are my preferred choices. But what I would recommend is use what I'd say here and then experiment with some of the other ones and see what they do to get a feel for things. So once you've opened up your settings panel, things are going to be broken down across the top into various different tabs and then the subsections on the left-hand side for each of them. Now, a lot of these are going to be enabled by default, and you can probably just go with those default options, but there's some that are newer features that are not enabled. I want to go through those. So let's start off with the global settings. You can see we can choose to control things like our global colors, CSS variables, and so on. So if you're using a framework or using CSS variables and CSS classes and things, which you should be if you're using bricks, I would recommend you leave these things on, including things like the builder tweaks and so on. But you'll notice that if we enable any of these, that'll open up additional new tabs at the top. So if you want to work with AI and you want to connect this up to your ChatGPT account, you can do that here. I don't use that side of things. So this is what I use. So once you come in, you've got your builder elements, and then you can choose what you want to enable or disable inside the AT or Advanced Themas elements. So do you want things like dark mode button, and so on. Then you've got all the different options underneath. Now I'm going to leave all these as they are. Same thing goes for permissions. I'm going to leave it for the administrator because I don't think anybody outside an administrator level really should be touching anything to do with this anyway. And if you want to allow file uploads for administrators for CSS and JSON files, you can do that here. You've got your miscellaneous. Now, because I've got ACF Pro installed on all of my Blueprint sites, what I do is I'll disable the ACF menu inside here and make sure that everything is kind of set up. So I use my own license. And I also like to have the remove all data, even though I have no reason to remove it. I do still like it when we've got this option to just kind of remove everything. Import and export, pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to worry about those. Reset, well, if you have been playing about and you want to follow along with what I've done, you could choose to reset if you want to, but don't do that on the site that you've been working on and you've set things up. Do it on a clean, fresh copy with Advanced Thema installed. So those are kind of the boring settings. Then you can jump into global colors. If you want to work with global colors, you can do that inside here. Personally, I use the color palette as part of my particular framework, which is Core Framework. So I don't really use the main kind of color palette side of things inside Advanced Thema anyway. However, as I said at the beginning of the video, if you want to use the global colors as part of Advanced Thema, or you want to use Advanced Thema to kind of create your own, no matter how simple or complex kind of framework, you could use that functionality inside here. For me, like I say, I use Core Framework for everything, and a lot of other users will use ACSS, so we don't need this kind of functionality. Then your Gutenberg settings, you can see we can do things like replace the Gutenberg color palette and remove the default color palette. So if you're allowing people to work, whether you sort of have a site that you're using with clients and you want to give them access to Gutenberg to add content in, you might want to keep that consistent color palette between both sides of things. By default, I don't have that function enabled. But like I say, if you're working with clients and you want that consistency between all the color palettes, check these options out because they could be very useful for you. If we jump over there to CSS variables, again, you can see we can set up our CSS variables inside here. But again, because I'm using Core Framework, I don't use these options. But you can import your framework from here as well if you want to. And you can see you can import this using a JSON file. CSS classes, again, same kind of thing inside here. I've got really simple setup. Basically, everything is disabled inside here because, again, all my styling, all those kinds of CSS-related things are all being done inside Core Framework. Builder tweaks, though, this is where I really do start to get stuck in and start customizing how everything looks and feels. And if we take a quick look at my install, you'll see that we've got all these shortcuts down the right-hand side that allow me to easily insert things like containers, text, headings, all those kinds of things. So I don't need to come over to the left-hand side, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but once you get used to having these tweaks inside you, you'll very quickly realize how much more productive you can be. For example, if we select this section, you can see I've also got shortcuts down the left-hand side to some of the main panels that we have inside the editor panel here. So again, just really quick and easy things to speed up doing everyday tasks you may do, hundreds of times on every single page. Having these makes life easy. So let's take a look at how we start to tweak those. So under the builder tweaks, Again, you can see things are broken down on the left-hand side. So your top bar, as its name suggests, is this bar across the top. So you can see we've got the normal default options, but we've also got an AT menu. And if we click on that, there's a bunch of options in there. Come back onto that in a moment. There's some extra little things inside here, and you can, again, customize this. However, in the latest versions of Advanced Theme, a lot of what would originally have been across here as icons, which you still can use if you want to, have all been superseded and put into this one drop-down menu as the functions and the features have been a lot more comprehensive and a lot more options. So it made more sense to have this drop-down. So let's take a look. We've got our top bar icon shortcuts. Now you can see anything that's got this L symbol afterwards is a legacy option. So they're left in here obviously for compatibility because people may like to have things set up that way. However, pretty much all of these, as we've seen, have been superseded by the AT menu. But if you didn't want to use the menu, you could disable that and you could use these options and have icons placed into that top bar. I just think it makes more sense to have this one simple drop down. So that's how I like to leave it. Then your structure panel. So we take a look here, you can see we've got more options here. And this is where you start to really get into the nitty-gritty of customizing things. Now, most of these top section here is just little quality of life enhancements. So, for example, a resizable structure panel. The structure panel, by its very nature, on a bigger screen, may not give you all the information you want. You can see once we start adding things in, we can get these icons and things, again, which we can customize various different parts of this inside Advanced Theme. But being able to resize this makes a lot of sense, especially when you start to use these different options for seeing exactly what element you have here, whether it's a section, div, paragraphs, and so on. Which for me, I really do like that because it's a nice, simple visual way of being able to see things. But making this resizable just makes my life a lot easier. So you can see we can resize this. And now that just makes sense. We can see more inside there. So if you've got a big ultra-wide screen or just a bigger screen, it's nice to be able to have this opened up a little bit larger. Now, there are also some other useful features inside here, things like expand all children elements, highlight nestable elements, and so on. Again, like I say, most of these are little visual tweaks, but once you kind of enable them and you start to use them, you'll realize how useful they are. For example, the expanding the child elements. Now, we can obviously use this collapse and expand all option, which will, as its name suggests, opens everything up. But once your site becomes, or a page becomes a lot bigger, this can be absolutely massive. So it would make more sense, for example, if we opened up, let's just close these down a second. We want to just open the head container. Well, I can use this option to just expand only that particular element block. So that's pretty cool to see. And again, like I say, they're just nice little quality of life enhancements. Now moving on underneath, we've got the shortcuts for creating the following elements. So things like your sections, your containers, and so on. And this is what you can see over on the right-hand side here. So if I want to add in a section, I don't have to come back over, click on the plus, find the section, click to insert it. I can just click and insert it straight from here. Inside the container, I want to add in a couple of blocks. There we go, it's my blocks. Inside one block, I want to add in a heading, some text, and I want to add in an image. You can see just how quick that actually is. If you had to go back and forth or use the keyboard shortcuts, you'd have to remember all of those or just do a lot of sort of to and fro. So I would 100% recommend you add these options down on the right-hand side. Now you notice there's some options I don't have enabled because these are things I don't really use that often. So enable, disable, whatever you think is useful for you. You can also enable the keyboard shortcuts. You can enable this if you want to. I don't really use keyboard shortcuts for most things inside here. I work inside the editor itself, but you can do it if you want to. Plus, you can also enable keyboard shortcuts by using this option in the bottom right. You can see we can switch them on, switch them off. Pretty simple and straightforward. Then if you want to, you can customize the styles and classes indicator, so you can change the colors of this if you want to, the default structure panel width, and so on. Then you've got your structure panel icon shortcuts. So we've got things like the elements tag, you've got structure helper, and so on. And you can set this up to be working between different modes. I just leave those as they are. You can see this is actually deprecated as a legacy option. Now, most of the options inside the contextual menu are basically left as default. I don't really use that too much. Let's come back up, hop over to the classes and styles. And this is where we can kind of get a better understanding of what we're doing with our classes and styles inside the editor. Like I say, all my classes and styles are either created inside Bricks itself or most of them are pulled in from Core Framework. But as you can see, there's a couple of options here, like a CSS variable picker. So we can choose our variables. Let me show you how this works. You'll notice that we've got this little V symbol next to things like our margins and so on. These are places where we can use variables. Now, your variables in this example are being pulled in from Core Framework, but you could create your own variables. You could even use Advanced Theme to create variables and access those here as well. But by default, we don't really have a way of being able to access these. This is where Advanced Thema makes this really nice and easy. So we click on this, you can see we've got bricks, or because I've got Core Framework installed, I also have Core Framework. So anything created inside bricks would be listed here. Anything inside Core Framework is listed here. So now I can adjust things like my spacing, so I can use any of my variables. So you can see we can choose the various different spacing options, click, add it in, job done, link them together. You can see this added all of them in, but we're using the variables now inside here, but this picker just makes it nice and easy to be able to see what's going on. So pretty cool. One of those things I would definitely recommend. You also see that we've got these options to show how this displays. Currently it displays over the left-hand column, but we may want to have it over the right-hand column. You may even want to have this as a full pop-up modal so you can see everything inside here in a much sort of easier fashion. Up to you how you want to work. I tend to sort of leave it on the left-hand side as it is there. Once you finish, close it down, job done. Now, most of the other options inside here are kind of little tweaks that I'm not going to go over and show you exactly what everyone does, but things like the color preview on hover. It basically just means that when you hover over a color, it will preview that inside the editor window. So if you're looking at the color and you want to see which has the best contrast, for example, with text and a background, instead of clicking to commit that color to see what it looks like, you can do it all on hover. It's just a nice, simple way of doing it. Same thing goes with a class preview on hover. If you want to select a class and you want to make sure it looks okay without having to click it, you can have that to preview on hover. Pretty cool, nice little things. Again, I would recommend having a nose through here and see what you think is useful. But try them one at a time. Don't get sort of bogged down and just enable everything because you just get confused. Then you've got your advanced CSS editor. Now, this is an area that is really, really useful once you start getting into working with any kind of CSS, which ultimately at some point you will do, even if it's really simple when it comes to working inside bricks itself. So let's just go and select, in this example, the block, come over to the CSS option, which we could use the shortcut here if we want to, and that opens up our Superpower CSS. Now, this is so much more useful than the default editor. So, for example, we want to use root because we want to target the element we've got selected, in this case, this block. Well, I don't want to write that in. Why would you want to write it in? Click the button. There you go. Job done. Added it in. Comment selected code. You can add comments if you want to. So we can select this code, click on comment, and you can add a comment to it. It puts the sort of blocks in there for you. So it saves you having to do it. They're just, again, like I say, just simple quality of life. Add components to your selectors. You can beautify your CSS. So if you've been typing your CSS in and it looks a bit of a jumbled mess, you can just select it, beautify it, and it'll just indent it and make everything look pretty cool. Great if you're working as part of a team or you just want to dump your ideas out on screen and then worry about making it look better afterwards. You've also got the shortcut sheet, which is underneath, which you can see we've got shortcuts for these things. So like R plus tab would do what we've seen here, which is add the root in, and various different options. So again, once you kind of get accustomed to this, if you work with CSS a lot, this can really speed up your workflow. And then you've also got full screen, so you can switch this over to full screen and just have everything without distractions. It's pretty cool. So next up, we've got elements. And this is where you can see I've got quite a lot of the options enabled because these are some really useful things. Things like the lorem ipsum generator. So instead of having to go off to a site like loremipsum.io, I think it is, or .com, you can do it inside the editor itself. So when you're just building things out, you can dump some lorem ipsum code text in there if you want to. You can even specify what that custom dummy content is going to be. So you can choose between, for example, lorem ipsum, or you can choose between your own custom dummy content and pop in whatever you want inside there. It's just a nifty little thing. Then you've got things like close all open style accordions by default. Once you start to open all these things up, it gets a little bit annoying. So opening the tabs up and everything is kind of closed by default just tidies the interface up. So you've got things like, disable elements outline when styling borders and box shadows. Silly little things, but when you're creating borders and box shadows and things, you don't want to have outlines and things like that. They're distracting you because you see them, but they're not going to be there on the end result. So it makes it nice that you can create these drop shadows and things without that distraction being there. Again, just something a little simple. Superpower the custom CSS controls. So this is what we've seen with the custom CSS right now. This has added the superpower to it, which gives you all those extra features. Increase the text control size, expand spacing controls, and so on. But where the real power starts to come in is we've got things like grid builder. You've got things like the box shadow generator, advanced text wrapper, focus point, mask helper, and the dynamic data modal. These are some new-ish features that really make Advanced Thema a much nicer way to work, doing things that you could still do inside bricks, but you would have had to have done them manually, and they could take a little bit of sort of hit and miss. let me show you some of these and why they're so super useful. Let's start off first of all with a CSS grid builder, or grid builder as it's called here. So I've inserted a section with a container and with 5 blocks inside. Now we want to use a CSS grid for this, so we'll select our container, we'll come over and set the display on here to be grid. Now obviously we could quite easily go in and start set the grid template columns and so on, and if you're comfortable doing that, crack on and do it. But sometimes it's much easier to have a visual way of doing it, especially when you want to make sure that your designs are great across all the different breakpoints. So we'll open this up and boom, we now have a visual representation of our blocks. Now we can say, well, how many columns and things do you want? Well, let's say 4 columns, 4 rows. And we're going to say we want to use min-max because we want to have that flexibility. I'm going to leave the gap as it is now because we can use a variable on there. Once we're outside here, it's a little easier. And now what we can do is we can just start to design things. So let's say we'll bring this one down, expand it. Actually, let's just expand it up here. We'll grab this one, position that here, and expand that. Same thing here. Drag this one over. You can see how quick and easy this is, and I don't have to do anything other than set things up visually. You know, you can overlap if you want to, you can get really creative. Then when you want to change it, you can click into tablet portrait and adjust the way it looks there, say for mobile landscape and so on. So you can set things up here for all the different breakpoints. And once we're happy, we'll apply that grid and everything has now been created for us. So now we can start just dropping in all the various different pieces. You don't see it that well on here because you've got the entire grid showing up, the 4x4 grid. But you see if we click inside and you can see now there's all our different component pieces. How easy was that to set up? And like I say, switch it over into the various different responsive modes and whatever you set up there will be in place for you as well. I don't need to worry about it. Then you can see if we come back to the container, everything is set up here and now I can even use my spacing. So we'll say I want to put something like just a bit bigger spacing. So let's go for this space L. Click outside. You can see we've now adjusted our spacing. Pretty cool. And again, like I say, this for me is one of the key things that I like about working with Advanced Thema are these things that just make my life easier. For example, take a look at what we would have had to have wrote to get this the way that we want for the rows and the template columns. Not beyond the realms of possibility, but so much quicker and easier doing it this way visually. Now, if you start to work with conditions, one of the limitations you've probably seen is that once you create that interaction or that condition on that particular element and you set everything up, when you want to do that on another element that is basically exactly the same, you can't copy and paste those conditions and everything over between the 2 different versions. However, with Advanced Thema, you enable the option to copy and paste interactions and conditions, and you can do just that. You can copy and paste them between the various different elements you're working on. Again, just a really simple time saver. Now, let's say you like to work with box shadows, and let's be honest about it, lots of designs are great with a good looking shadow. This, again, is where Advanced Thema makes our lives super easy. So if we come into, for example, our box shadow option, we've got the ability to be able to create our box shadows like we've had for ages. You also got this box shadow generator. Open this up and we now have a nice visual way of working. And if you've ever seen really good drop shadows and some of the effects you can create with that, most of those are made up of multiple layers of shadows. And this is where this particular generator shines. You can, if you want to, create as many as you want. You can generate your layers and all those kinds of good things. However, there's also a preset section, which probably has most of the bases covered. So you can see we've got tons of different box shadow effects inside here for various different types of shadows. Pretty cool and simple. And then once you find the one you want, you can import the layers and continue editing them, or you can quick apply, job done, it's been added to that particular element, and you're good to go on to the next bit. Again, like I say, so just quick and easy. Another feature that's really useful is when you're working with images, and let's be honest, most websites, lots of images are included. One of the things you want to make sure is that that image, whatever the focal point of it is, looks great on any kind of device, screen size, and so on. This, again, is another feature. Again, you can do all these if you want to manually inside Bricks. It's not replacing or creating a new function, it's just making it visual and easier. So I've got an image set in the background of this particular block. And if we take a look at the background, we've got this new option called focus point. And this works the same whether you set an image for a background or it's just the image element. You can do the same. We can now click on this and we've got 2 ways of working. We've got this 9-point grid, which we can say, right, the focal point is this section. And then we've got these examples on the right-hand side. So you can see as we move this around, based upon whether you've got a landscape or you've got a portrait image, you can see this is what it's going to look like. So you can choose exactly where the focal point actually is inside this grid. But that isn't always the most flexible. It may be somewhere in between two of these elements. Well, let's go into custom, and we now get this little focus point reticle, and we can now move this around, and you can see in real time, we're getting to see what it's going to look like on various different resolutions and various different screen sizes. So now we can make sure that our image, when things are resized and look at on a mobile, for example, or a tablet in landscape mode or portrait mode, we can make sure we can get as close to the perfect representation of our image as possible. And then once we're happy, we'll hit apply. And you can see now this set the background position of a custom, like I said, which you could do before. And it's set the X and Y axis inside there based upon what we've set up. Want to change it? Come back into your focus point, change it to something completely different, hit apply, and it will update accordingly. Just a nice little quality of life enhancement. If you work with dynamic data, which, let's be honest, again, if you're using bricks, chances are you're going to be working with it, you'll very quickly realize there's an awful lot of different tags you can use when it comes to dynamic data. And this long list that you've got to scroll through becomes a little bit of a nightmare. Well, one of the newer features that we have inside Advanced Thema is the dynamic data modal. Now, I really like this because it does just make it so quick and easy. So let's say we'll take this heading. We'll come over to our dynamic data, and normally we'd have a little drop-down list here we could choose from. But we now have this nice modal with all the different types of dynamic data we can reference. And it's still an awful lot of options inside here. But let's say you only actually want to work with date information or post information. Just click on the one that you want and filter it out. Now let's say you might also want to work with site and archive information. We'll click on those and you can add those in as well. So we can customize the look of this when we're working inside here to make things so much quicker and easier and get rid of the distractions in sections that we don't really need. And you may well find this will grow and expand as you start to have more features available and as brick starts to grow. I think that's only going to make this even more useful, especially when you're on a smaller screen. Now, if we move on down to the elements icon shortcuts, there's various different options inside here. You can see I've got the class contextual menu selected and the left tabs shortcuts, but basically everything else I've got disabled. But again, you can use whatever you want. I find that my kind of way of working is probably quite simplistic. I don't need to have a lot of these distractions and things inside the editor itself, so I tend to leave these off. Plus, a lot of these are legacy options, so for the most part, most of the legacy options, if I've never used them in the past, I'll leave them off now because they've probably been superseded and made better anyway. Then you've got your left tab shortcut top offset, which allows you to kind of fine tune that visually, and your left tab shortcuts, what you want to include in there. So things like content, layout, typography, and so on. So if you're wondering what they are, they're these icons down the left-hand side. Now it's worth bearing in mind that when you have nothing selected in your structure panel, and you go back to just sort of adding elements in, they will disappear because they're not relevant. But once you kind of click inside anyway, they will become available. And you can just use these to quickly switch into the various different panels you have here, which again, doesn't sound like a lot. But when you kind of think you're in content, you think, okay, I want to go to style. And in style, I got to open typography up. 3 clicks. Whereas this is 1. Doesn't sound like a lot, but this is the whole concept behind Advanced Thema is little tweaks that make you more productive. Cool. But you can customize exactly what you want to show inside there as well. If there are features you never use or rarely use, disable them and keep it simple. Then underneath we've got some custom settings. So for example, set P as the default HTML tag for basic text. So instead of setting things like divs and so on or spans, you can specify this is set by default. The same thing goes for images. Whenever you insert an image, it'll automatically be tagged and set as a figure. Just little things that you probably would have had to do afterwards yourself. If you remember to do them, you can have all these things done automatically for you. So again, there's some really new useful features here. Choose what you think is relevant to the way that you work, but most of these are pretty useful. I don't set things like the SVG as the default library for icons because I like to choose what I want from the list we've got. But again, if you use the SVG option all the time, you can set that to be the default anyway. Now if we come into templates, you can see inside here we've got a couple of options for when you create and save your own templates. So again, I don't really use a lot inside here. I keep things pretty simple, but you can say quick save and auto generate thumbnails. It's quite nice that this will actually generate a thumbnail for the template you create, but by default, you don't have a thumbnail associated with it. And that can make when you have a large library of templates that you've created, it can make it quite problematic to figure out which is heading 1 versus, or header 1 versus header 2. You kind of get the idea. Having the automatically generated thumbnail, just a great time saver. And add featured image column into the templates admin screen. I just think that's super useful because it just means you've got this visual representation inside that particular section. Keyboard shortcuts, like I say, I don't really use them, but if you do, you can easily come in here and customize them to get exactly what you want. And finally, inside here, we've got the strict editor view. Now, if you don't know what the strict editor is, if you hand this off to clients and you still want to give them access to Bricks Builder, you may want to give them access to only limited features inside any of the elements. So, for example, inside the image element, you may allow them to change the image, maybe change the caption if you're using captions and the alt text, but everything else is locked. Well, you can use the strict editor options to do exactly that. It's pretty powerful, and that requires a video, I think, in its own right. So if you want to see that, let me know down below. So all this section does is basically enable or disable what you can see on the left-hand side. Don't care about white label, you could disable it. You kind of get the idea. But what this allows you to do is if you've got colored branding and things like that, you want to make sure that the editor that the client actually sees is the same color as maybe your branding for the admin section of your website or their branding. You can change the color inside here, and then all the icons and everything else will be that color. It's quite nice. And the same thing goes, you can change the logo for the builder itself. Your toolbar, then you can choose disable toolbar icon, so you can disable anything you want inside there. And the same goes for the elements. But I would set this up on an instance by instance basis if I was handing this off to a client. For example, you can see we can choose what elements they could actually see using the strict editor view. And the same thing goes down for the builder tweaks. You can customize things inside here. So by default, I would leave all of these basically disabled. But then if I hand off to a client, I would then customize these for their particular website and their requirements. But if you'd like to see a video on working with a strict editor view in Advanced Theme and how you can use this to restrict what clients can do, let me know in the comment section down below. Okay, so these are all the settings. Once you've set up what you want, save your settings and you are good to go. So let's hop back into the editor. Now you've seen some of the key things that I recommend that you should use, but we only briefly looked at the AT main menu at the top. Inside here, there's a lot of additional really useful features. For example, if you come from something like Figma and you're working with a grid to design things, and you want to make sure when you transition over here, everything is looking the way that you want. You just want to visually check. Well, you can go into your grid guides and you can see we now get our grid guides displayed inside here. And you can customize these based upon the different views. So you can see if we switch it down to here, we've still got 12. Well, we may want to change that. Well, you can do that simply by coming back up, click on the little cog icon, and let's just say we only actually want to use 4 columns for the mobile. There we go. And now we're using 4 columns. It's nothing more than a visual way of seeing if everything is lining up the way you want. It's quite nice, quite useful, but again, not everybody has a use for it. Then you can go into X mode. So let's switch this back into full desktop. Go to your X mode, and that will basically just outline every single element in the design and also convert everything to black and white. So it removes a lot of the distractions that color and things brings to the table and allows you to just check for visual hierarchy, position consistency, and those kinds of things. Again, quite useful. We'll just disable that, come back in, got a contrast checker. So you can use this to check the contrast. So if you want to make sure that accessibility is bang on and you don't have like darkish text on a dark background, which you might think looks good, but from an accessibility point of view is really poor, then you can use this to check your accessibility and so on. You can switch into dark mode, your strict editor settings. So once you enable this, this will then switch you into strict editor mode, which you can then choose what functions and everything are available. Again, like I say, I think that's something that deserves its own video. Then you can things like your global class manager. And again, you can see all keyboard shortcuts for all this. So you can come in, there's all your classes. They're categorized and categorized with you've got bulk actions, so you can bulk rename, duplicate, group, lock things, unlock things, so you can't accidentally make mistakes. There's so many options. You can rename this inside here, tons of options. Just allows you to manage your classes and things so quick and easy. You've also got your global color manager, which will show you all your different colors. Now I'm looking at the core framework options. And again, you can see we can set as default. We can rename the palette, add new palettes in, duplicate it. You can reposition these. You can move them around, add new colors inside here. But I tend to just use the default options. That's part of my core framework. But you could use this if you wanted to. Now, what we didn't touch upon it, there's a global query loop manager, so you can actually create and save query loops, and then you can access it inside here, and you can do various different things with it. That's pretty powerful and pretty useful. There's also your variable manager, which will show you any or all of your variables inside here, which again, you can customize and do various different things inside here, save into your database and so on. There's lots of great options inside this menu, so I would always recommend you have a good look around there and see how it all works. So those are what I would consider to be the vital components you use with Advanced Thema. But have I missed anything out? Are there things that you think, actually, Paul, you really need to be using that function because it's such a time saver? Let me know in the comment section down below. And once you start to work with Advanced Thema and you've set it the way you like, you'll find that if for any reason you don't have it enabled on a site, you kind of feel like you're working with one hand behind your back and everything just feels a little bit slower and a little bit more clunky. And I think this is the beauty of Advanced Thema. Do you need it? Absolutely not. Do you miss it when it's not there? Absolutely. And there are so many more things that Maxim's bringing to the table. He's got so many different things that he's kind of always adding new features that can enhance and speed up your workflow. And I would recommend joining the Facebook group for Advanced Thema to see exactly what's going on. Anyway, that's what I wanted to cover. If you want to find out more about my blueprint and how I set everything up with bricks, check out this video next. My name is Paul C. Until next time, take care.